Are we live yet? Okay.
And we are live here in the live stream, multi-stream edition of the Runnin with the Herd podcast, powered up by Herd Nation, a part of the Rivals Network. I'm your host and the producer of the Runnin with the Herd podcast, Aaron Coleman, alongside Josh Stowers. Josh, welcome, as always.
Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. And we'll be joined momentarily by Herd Nation moderator for the site, Aaron Perkins. And later in the show, we will be joined by the gentleman from the Boneyard Podcast to talk a little bit of ECU. So, taking a look at Marshall through the first two games, obviously, both dominating performances against Navy and NC Central. Josh, what are your biggest takeaways from those first two games, offensively and defensively? And what have you seen that stood out to you the most during the Huff era?
On the offensive side of the ball, I mean, obviously we've been slinging the ball around quite a bit. I mean, I know Coach Huff talked about wanting to score a lot of points and move the ball pretty quickly, and something else that has stood out obviously is the tempo, and that's something he had talked about before the season started. But without looking at the numbers, honestly, just and I get trying to, I guess, maybe not necessarily challenge Grant, but I mean, like, get Grant in a rhythm with the offense and get him accustomed, because, let's face it, I mean, last year was a reduced season, and, he really, that was his first game experience there. So, I mean, like, he's still young in terms of, game snaps. So
Right.
I get, what they're trying to do there. And I mean, like I said, those two opponents, especially, last week, but I mean, even more so in the Navy game. I mean, that's something Coach Huff talked about was, he thought that they really had the advantage at receiver, against Navy's defensive backs. And I mean, obviously we did, but, just the amount of, passes Grant has thrown through the first 2 week games is maybe a little shocking to me, but, it's, I mean, he's been pretty effective. I mean, I think he's completing around nearly 70% of his passes. I mean, like, he's had a couple interceptions, but I mean, like, I would rather have a guy that is aggressive in what he's trying to do and make mistakes because you can correct those versus somebody who's, maybe timid and afraid to make those plays because it's harder to correct that. I mean, it's just it's maybe just a read or something like that, a check down that he should make. Those are things that can be corrected versus, someone that isn't necessarily okay with, putting the foot on the pedal. That's per se. But defensively speaking, we're kind of what I thought we would be.
Right.
I thought we had a chance to be pretty good defensively. I thought the front sevens played really well. Obviously, the back guys have done well too because, we if we're not the top pass defense in the country, through 2 games, I don't know who is. Honestly, without looking, my God, I mean, Navy didn't throw for. I don't think they had 100 yards, and NC Central wasn't much better. So, but like I said, defensively, we're kind of what I thought we would be. We pressure the ball. They swarm to the ball. It's kind of the same thing we saw last year, and even the last couple of years. But we've just got guys that are have another year or two experience on them, and I just the thing that's probably stood out to me the most on that side of the ball is just the number of bodies we've been running through on the defensive line. I mean,
Yeah.
It's really been impressive. I mean, we played even some of the younger guys through the first 2 games. I'm going to butcher this name, I know, but Takezi Leg. Jay-Sean Kaufman, both of those guys have played a ton already through those 2 games. So, those guys developing and coming along, this fast in the season or early in the season, however you want to say it, could pay huge dividends for us later in the year. And guys like Kobe Cumberlander, Shane Simmons, Jamari Edwards. I mean, those guys have been what we kind of thought they would be, honestly. I mean, like, there's just consistent players, guys that make plays when given the chance. And so, but like I said, that's probably what stood out the most to me is the defensive line.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that's stood out to me so far this season from the defensive side of the ball is kind of the leadership role that Eli's taking as far as the linebacking core and the defense as a whole. He's been hitting guys hard, he's been making plays, and he's really kind of taken that ownership of, being a defensive captain and kind of like taking over where Tavante Beckett left off last year, in my opinion. I think he's kind of taken that next step forward in his development as a leader and as a player on the field. I mean, I know that Coach Huff has mentioned him a lot in his post-game pressers, and he's really kind of taken ownership of that role. And as far as another thing that stood out to me as far as the season is gone is just our overall depth. Overall depth at receiver has stood out. The depth at running back has stood out. The defensive line, like you mentioned, has got a lot of bodies that have been rotated in and out of the lineup. Guys like Jay-Sean Kaufman, like you said, and TJ Johnson's emerged a little bit, and Jamari Edwards and Kobe Cumberlander. We've seen what we've seen from them. Sam Burton had a big game against Navy. I mean, it was just a lot of guys in and out of that rotation, making plays and doing things. But the leadership aspect is something that I think was lacking a few years ago from some of our players. But a lot of guys have really taken ownership of that and have really translated their play into the rest of the defense, and it's kind of setting the tone for the rest of the defense. That's why I mentioned Eli, because he was named Defensive Player of the Week over at Conference USA, and he's been doing a lot of big things. So he's kind of, taken off a little bit this year, and I see him getting a couple more Conference USA Defensive Player of the Weeks before the season is over.
Yeah, I mean, that's a guy before the season started that I kind of pegged as someone that I thought had a chance to, not necessarily maybe this year, but, someone that I thought could easily step into like that, Marshall for a couple seasons in a row had the, the Conference Defensive Player of the Year. And he's a guy, I mean, with the start he's off to now already, I mean, he's got a shot at it this year possibly, but he's most certainly a guy that I thought had a chance to be, to be special before he left. And like I said, he's kind of already proving that. So, yeah, I mean, and in terms of like the leadership, like you were talking about, like something that, we talked a lot about last year was, just COVID and how it affected those guys. And, I think it was a wake-up call in a lot of ways. And, those guys, dealt with a really, really difficult year. And, with the way the season ended last year, I think obviously that, there was a bad taste in their mouth. And, with all the things they dealt with last year, I think it just matured them even more than what a season normally would. So I think that definitely plays part in what you were talking about with the leadership.
Definitely. And if you want to add a comment or a question for our staff, you can. You could send a question through either Facebook or Twitter. We are streaming on both platforms right now. We are live streaming in the Runnin with the Herd podcast, powered up by Herd Nation, a part of the Rivals Network. Aaron Coleman alongside Josh Stowers. We'll be joined by Jared Shafit of the Boneyard Podcast to talk a little ECU here shortly, and we will momentarily be joined by Aaron Perkins. Right now, we have a comment from one of our fans of the show, Vanessa Clarkson, I should say, softball alum here. And Vanessa, thank you for your comment. And if you have a comment for myself or Josh or Aaron or even the guys from the Boneyard Podcast, you could send one as well. And so we are going to go now to Jared Shafit of the Boneyard Podcast to talk a little ECU. Jared, welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, guys, for having me.
Absolutely. And we're also going to add the second half of the Boneyard Podcast as well. How you doing, sir?
Good. How we doing, fellas?
Good, man.
Good. And ECU, gentlemen, is one of those teams that even though they have an 0-2 record, they are a very deceptive 0-2. They were hanging with South Carolina in that second game, and just a couple of things kind of didn't go their way, but they came up on the short end of it. Jared, we'll start with you. Talk to us a little bit about that ECU team and just their expectations here in 2021.
Yeah, the expectations, guys, for this ECU football team. I mean, it's really, I mean, it feels like it's bowl game or bust, but at the same time, you got to remember this is still a program that's rebuilding. I mean, we've gone through about 7 years now of down years from after the former staff and head of the athletic department fired. ECU legend Ruffin McNeil. So we've been in some dark times, but Coach Houston has this team headed in the right direction. He's got some coordinators that know what they're doing. They're doing a pretty damn good job of getting things rolling, especially on the defensive side. That was something that we saw last week. The defensive side of the ball played outstanding. Just wasn't good enough to get the win.
Right. Artie, talk a little bit about what you've seen from ECU this year, offensively, defensively. When I saw a little bit of that South Carolina game last week, and I saw some guys that were flying around to the ball, some guys that were really locked in on defense. Talk a little bit about what you saw from that group.
Yeah, I mean, defensively, I think we have honestly played a lot better than I expected to start the season, to be honest with you. Our defense has been something that's been lackluster, especially the last 4 or 5, 6 years. They've been bottom of the FBS very, very famously. So to see this defense come out and play the way that they've played the last couple of weeks, it gives me a lot of hope. This offense, on the other hand, is something that was supposed to be a little bit better. And you know, as advertised, it's supposed to be an explosive offense, supposed to come out and be able to put a lot of points on the board. They haven't really done that in the first 2 weeks against App State, against South Carolina. You know, outside of that first trick play, you know, from Tyler Snead to Cy Hatfield on the very first play of the game, our offense kind of sputtered the rest of the game. So it's kind of disheartening to see from an offensive standpoint, and we're not able to kind of live up to the capability of what we are and what we can be from an offense. But defensively, I am excited about where we're headed. I'm excited about Blake Harrell, the defensive coordinator, and what he's doing with this defense. You know, Coach Houston is getting us there. And we're not there yet. We're not a finished product by any means. We're 0-2. And obviously you don't want to be that, you know, last week's game against South Carolina is a game we felt that we should have won. But we're still heading in the right direction. I know a lot of people in Pirate Nation are very frustrated and very upset right now, but bear with us because I think things are building in the right direction.
Now,
Guys,
Josh, go ahead, Josh.
My bad. Guys, it seems like through 2 games, you know, albeit the opponents have been maybe a little bit tougher, it seems like you're struggling to run the ball. What can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and kind of hit on that. The two defenses we've played. I mean, App State, a top 10 defense last year, returned I believe it's 9 or 10 guys on the defensive side of the ball. So that's tough. I mean, when you have a running back room, kind of like what ECU has with Keaton Mitchell and Rajay Harris, I mean, you expect those guys to put up 150, 200 yards each week as a unit. But unfortunately, I believe last week they put up about 115 yards. So it wasn't good enough to get it done. But I do think that there's some big play capabilities there. You've got these 2 guys that, I mean, they're both different style backs. You got Rajay, who I mean, he's that heavy down back. He's not the biggest guy in the world, but he's got that kind of strength to break through the line. But then you got Keaton Mitchell, who, I mean, against App State on a screenplay, the first touchdown of the game. I mean, he had the fastest sprint speed of any player in college football 2 weeks ago. So, I mean, that just goes to show that there's a lot of athleticism in the running back room. Those 2 guys, I mean, they're technically freshmen with all the COVID exemptions now, but I mean, coming off their true freshman year last year, they kind of stole the show last year. I mean, we were all expecting them to be 3-4, and then they just kind of took over and became the 1-2. And I know that the skills there, and all of ECU fans know that there's a lot of athleticism, a lot of skill there.
All right, Jared, Artie, talk a little bit about Holton Ayers, the quarterback for ECU. I mean, obviously, he's an experienced player, but he's had a little bit of inconsistency, and it showed through the first 2 games against App State and against South Carolina. He's probably the key to that entire offense and the common denominator between having success and having some of those wins versus going 0-2 to start the young season. Guys, talk a little bit about the QB and what he can do to kind of steer the ship right for the Pirates this year and in this game.
I'll go ahead and start with that. Holton has not played up to his potential to start. We know what Holton can be. He's a hometown kid, comes out of Greenville. This is his 3rd year in the system, and he's a veteran now. And so, we kind of expected Holton to come out and to kind of show that veteran leadership and kind of take a stranglehold, especially on this offense and this team as a leader. He still has the capabilities. He still has everything that, to do. And you're right. He absolutely is the vocal point to our offense. If Holton isn't getting it going, we have no chance in Hades of beating anybody. So, to me, he has not performed the way he should have, especially against South Carolina. I think he only had 77 yards passing in that game. That's just not going to get it done against anybody. It's not going to get it done against an FCS opponent. So that's just lackluster. But I truly believe that he can right the wrongs. I know he's hearing all the noise from the outside sources, and I know that's kind of feeding into what he feels like right now. I like what Coach Houston said after the game. Holton's our guy. We're going to stick with Holton until things, just get, out of hand. But to me, Holton has a time clock. He has a certain window to kind of steer the ship and get it right. I think he's got a couple of weeks. And I think it starts with this Marshall game, kind of getting it back on track and playing a good game. Even if we don't win, Holton needs to come out and play well enough for us to win this football game, for him to keep his job.
Yeah, and I'll kind of echo that. I mean, after the game, Artie and I sat down and talked in our hotel room, and I mean, it definitely was. This last week was probably Holton Ayler's worst game of his college football career. Mm-hmm. He looked in the first quarter. We were on a text chain, and we even said in the text chain that Holton Ayler's. I mean, he looked like he wasn't confident with the ball. He wasn't his kind of dog mentality that he usually has. That kind of I'm going to run over you or I'm going to throw it down your throat. He didn't have that. And it was kind of strange to see that. I think his confidence was shook against App, and then also after not being able to really get anything going in the first half. And you saw it. I mean, it took – Holton Ayler's had 77 yards passing. The first play of the game, the trick play, was a 75-yard touchdown pass by a wide receiver. So Holton Ayler's really only had 2 more passing yards than one of our wide receivers had on the day. And when you're doing that against an SEC team, you can't expect to win, especially when you like we just talked about, can't get the running backs going like you would like them to.
Yeah, certainly. And this is a big game for both teams. Obviously, it's Marshall's first real test of the year, and it's a test for ECU as well. I mean, obviously, if you look at past history, ECU and Marshall have had great games against one another. If you remember the GMAC Bowl, Josh, I know you remember that, between Byron Leftwich and David Garrard, 64-61 down in Mobile. And, of course, the big catch that Aaron Dobson had in the Joan, that one-handed grab that was on SportsCenter for about a month and a half. So, Josh, speak a little bit to the history of ECU and Marshall and just the natural rivalry that takes place between these two teams, obviously stemming back to 1970 and the terrible crash that took the 75 lives, but what it's been in recent memory and just how these two teams and these two schools, go at it on the gridiron.
Obviously, like you said, it stems back from the crash. That's something that I think just about anybody that's a fan of Marshall or ECU is aware of. I mean, because, there are plaques and monuments outside of each stadium. But these two teams are teams that, like, I think, as far as, like, when I say old fans, I'm gonna include myself into that because I have reached the age of 40 this year. But I think us old fans think these two teams should be playing a lot more often than what they have been. I mean, it's a great rivalry that stems back to the, you know, well, obviously, then, but even, years since then, there's just always close games. I think somebody on our message board, posted the other day, like, the outcomes, like the last 3 or 4 games have been, really close, short of a couple. And, like I said, there's just always a lot of emotion in this game. It's kind of like one of those unwritten rivalries. It's not that's not the first team that comes to mind when you think of rivalry from Marshall, and I'm sure it's not for ECU either. But I think once you sit down and look at it, both teams, I think, are names that eventually come up as teams that, like, you want to see playing more often.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like I said, there's a lot of emotion in that game. I mean, for this weekend for us, the Young Thundering Herd will be back on campus, and they're going to honor those guys, so that'll be great. And just I think it's important for the players. I mean, any new fans of either team, to kind of understand and know the history between the two teams, and it just adds to the game, adds to the environment. I mean, I think the Joan will be rocking Saturday, and I'm really excited for the game.
Yeah, it should definitely be an exciting game, and I have a good feeling that ECU is going to bring a good contingent of fans up from Greenville for this game. Jared, speak a little bit about how the fan base is feeling under Coach Houston. Do you think they feel that they've turned the corner? Do you think that after about 7 years of trying to find their way, that under Coach Houston they're finally on that path to success?
Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask some of the fans that are on the ECU football Facebook page, no, they want to burn it down and start all over again. If you ask the other half, they're like, no, we got to give them some time. I tend to side on the side that we should give him some more time. I mean, he's only in year 3 of his stint here at ECU. I mean, and then Artie and I, we've said this time and time again on the Boneyard Podcast that last year we just kind of throw last year out the window. I mean, you think about, you lose three non-conference games, including the game with Marshall at ECU. You lose that game, you lose the Norfolk State game, and then you lose the South Carolina game, and then there's a lot of close losses that ECU has during the season, and I think last year we could have been a bowl eligible team had we had a full season, a full training camp, but we didn't have that, unfortunately. Now, I will say that there are some decisions that Coach Houston will have to eventually make as far as like the quarterback situation. I know a lot of people, that's been the biggest talk of the town this week in Greenville and in Pirate Nation as a whole, is what do you do? Can we start somebody else? Can we look at a guy like Mason Garcia, the backup quarterback, who he really only has one start in his career? That's against Navy, a game that ECU lost by 5 points last year. To me, I don't think you go that route yet. You got to ride with your hot hand, or ride with the hand you're dealt, and that's whole nailers right now. Mason Garcia is way too green behind the ears, but I think that there is a time for him, and Coach Houston said that in his press conference yesterday. He said there will be a time where Mason Garcia is our starting quarterback, but that's not right now. That's coming down the road, and next year or the years coming. But we got to see some momentum. ECU has to get 4 or 5 wins this year before I think the critics start shutting up. I think that we really need to see 5 or 6 wins. That's why I think it's a bowl or bust kind of year. But I also I have faith in athletic director John Gilbert and the leadership at East Carolina to really take a look at this and look at all the extenuating circumstances around the program right now and look, okay, do we want to fire a head coach that is building momentum, has the culture headed in the right direction inside that ECU football locker room? I mean, ECU is on the come up in football. They're there in baseball, basketball. We're not a basketball school. So the athletic director has to really say, okay, do we go on and fire a head coach? And I don't think that's the answer right now. I think you got to give him 4 or 5 years, get a full roster, and go from there.
And to be honest with you guys, Artie and Jared, I mean, Scotty Montgomery left the program in not great shape when he was dismissed from the program.
Exactly.
I mean, you think about how other teams around the college football world have been left when teams are dismissed, when guys don't have that full 4 or 5 years of their recruiting classes, their guys to start and build the culture in the way that it should be built. Mm-hmm. And when you have that, when you have stability, things tend to go in the right direction. If you don't have stability, you're looking at 3 or 4 years of 4-8, 5-7, 2-10, whatever. And it's just not good for the team, the athletic department, the fan base, etc. So, I mean, in my opinion, from an outsider's perspective, I think that they are headed in the right direction. And that was evident during the last 2 games of the season. They put 50-plus points on SMU, a team that would have gone to a bowl game had they not, had COVID issues and so on and so forth. And they won the game before that too. So they were clearly playing hard. They just needed to do the right things in order to win the football game. But I think that he has them pointed in the right direction. Now, Josh and I have talked a lot about our Coach Charles Huff, and the energy that he brings and kind of the juice that he brings not only on game day, but in practice and press conferences, etc. Guys, Artie, I'll start with you. From an outsider's perspective, when you look at Coach Huff and what he brings to this game, what he brings to this matchup from the coach's perspective, what do you see there?
Honestly, I think that he's got a team that prioritizes winning. Marshall, over the years has tried to build a steady program, and I think he's only added to that. He's trying to prioritize winning. He's trying to prioritize a team that wants to get to the Conference USA Championship and win a Conference USA Championship and get to a bowl game consistently. In my eyes, Coach Houston is trying to be what Coach Huff is, right now, trying to get a program that prioritizes winning, that wants to go out and play with their guys. And they treat every single game like week one. It's a do or die week one type of scenario. We got to go out and just treat every game like, we just have to go out here and win this matchup. So from my perspective, the way he's leading Marshall and the way that his men are fighting every single week, week in and week out, it's admiring. I love to see it. I want our team to kind of model after that a little bit. And I want Coach Houston to get our program to where he's trying to get Marshall to get to in Conference USA.
Personally, guys, I think that this rivalry is better when both teams are on equal footing. I mean, when you look at that 2013 game, you had Shane Carden for East Carolina. You had Rakeem Cato, as a lot of us Marshall fans remember. And even though it was a decided victory in terms of Marshall, it was going into that game as a shootout between 2 quality quarterbacks in Conference USA and ECU's last year in Conference USA. So before we sign off here for tonight, gentlemen, keys to the game. Josh, I'm going to start with you. Keys to victory for Marshall against ECU.
I think we've got to run the ball better.
Agreed.
In game 1, we were somewhat ill-effective. Game 2, we had big yardage, but I think you have to take into consideration who the opponent was, but it just doesn't seem like it's been a well-oiled machine for us on the ground so far. I mean, obviously, I know Grant's thrown up some big numbers through the air, but I think Coach Huff talked about it in his press conference. It's just something was off Saturday, and I think a lot of people You know, obviously it's hard to be upset about a win, you know, in the, with that kind of, you know, margin of victory, but it just, you know, something was a little off Saturday. So I think it's a matter of focus and you know, execution. And then, you know, I think we got to be a little bit better on the ground. I think if we can run the ball effectively, I think it's only going to make Grant the passing game better. You know, same thing. You know, Jared was kind of talking about with Holton down there. I mean, you have to be able to run the ball to open up the pass game. I mean, I know that's cliche and it's generic to say in terms of football, but it is what it is. You know, any good team that any good rushing attack is chances are, outside of like an option team, is going to have a good passing, at least a consistent passing game, just because, you know, the threat's there. So you know, those are the two things for me. You know, just be a little bit more focused and be a little bit better on the ground.
For me, I would say ball security is a big thing for the Marshall side of things. I mean, obviously, in that Navy game, we lost a few fumbles, threw a couple of picks, and you can't afford the big mistake. I mean, you know, muff punts, those sorts of things. And if you clean those up, I generally do believe that Marshall will be on top of this one. Jared and Artie, keys to the game, ECU versus Marshall. What are you looking at? We'll start with you, Jared.
Oh yeah, so I think that the biggest thing is winning in the trenches, right? ECU did a better job of that last weekend against South Carolina, who, I mean, has some really good running backs in their running back room. Getting downfield, the biggest thing coming out of the App State game was the triggering on defense, right? You kept hearing that word. It was a buzzword around campus, buzzword around ECU, buzzword all over the place. Everybody's saying it. The defensive side of the ball is saying it. Head coach is saying it. Defensive coordinator saying it. They're all saying it, right? Got to trigger better. So, and they did that. They came out and they did that. Now, what I would like to see is be able to stop the run on the outside. On the fourth quarter drive that USC ended up going and winning and scoring that last second field goal on, they hit a lot of plays, big plays on the outside. Now, with that being said, if they can hold the line on the defensive side of the ball and really take away any passing game, then I think that ECU has a decent shot at least keeping the game close. Now, flip it on its head on the offensive side of the ball. Holton Ahlers has to play better. Holton Ahlers, he's the guy. He's going in. He needs a bounce back game. Last week, Artie and I, after the game, talked about it quite a bit. Once again, said, hey, this would be a kind of a coming out party again for Holton Ahlers. I mean, we've seen it before, him not have a great game. We saw it back in his freshman year against North Carolina A&T, and then the very next week comes out and beats Carolina. So, I mean, that was big for ECU, and we've seen bounce backs from him. He's got to block out all the talk that's coming from all these Sunday morning coaches, right? And he's got to come out there and play his style of football. He can't be scared to run the ball, and he's got to also be able to find his targets. He's got a lot of great receivers on the outside, and I mean the skill positions for ECU. I think those really are where ECU stands out. They have for the past 10, 15 years. But if Holton Ahlers can hit the ball to those skill players, then he'll have a better week than last week. So those are my two keys.
Yeah, to kind of build off of what Jared said, you know, for me on the defensive side of the ball is to build off of what we did last weekend against South Carolina. That offense only scored 13 points against our defense because they had a pick 6 in that game. So to be able to build off of what we did last weekend, take that momentum into Huntington, Virginia, or West Virginia, and to be able to kind of have a kind of defensive mindset of we did some really good things last weekend. Let's carry this into it. I know we had a loss, but let's carry that into next weekend and let's build off of that. Looking for Xavier Smith. I'm looking for Jaquan McMillan to have very big games in this particular matchup. We need both of those guys to play well in this matchup if we want to win. So for me, on the defense side of the ball, kind of build off of what we did last weekend, because to me, our defense played pretty well. We should have won that game according to our defense. On the offensive side of the ball, just like Jared said, this is really going to be another coming out party for Holton Ahlers. If we're going to get it done, it's going to be on his shoulders. It's going to be on his back. I think our running game gets back to normal. I think the two-headed monster we have in Rajay Harris and Keaton Mitchell, I think they get it going. But for me, and I've been beating this horse for a long time, I think our receivers, somebody really needs to step up from our receiving core, whether it's C.J. Johnson, whether it's Cy Hatfield, whether it's Tyler Snead. Somebody really needs to step up from that receiving core and have a monster game, not just a good game, not a great game, but a monster game to kind of submit themselves and to kind of give Holton some cushion and some confidence going forward. So I think defense needs to build off what they did last week. And I think somebody from our receiving core on the ECU side of the ball needs to have a monster game for us to go into, hostile territory and win this game.
All right, keys to the game from both sides. Artie, Jared, thank you very much for joining us here in the Running with the Herd podcast. We certainly appreciate it. Hopefully you guys got what you needed on your end. Yeah. And we'll look forward to talking to you again once these two teams play a little bit down the road later on this decade. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
See you guys.
That was Artie and Jared from the Boneyard Podcast covering ECU football. And we're going to wrap it up here in just a little bit. Couple of Facebook messages and Twitter messages from some of our fans. Tim Mayo talking a little bit about the running back room. A lot of skill there with guys like Knowledge McDaniel and Rasheen Ali and Sheldon Evans. And then Trevor chiming in on Periscope saying, hey, what's up, Trevor, who had 4 touchdowns, but he had 59 yards on the ground. And Knowledge McDaniel had 67 yards rushing against North Carolina Central, but half of that was on one run. Is it a deal with the offensive line? Do you think they're coming together well, or do you think they need to come together better? Or do you think it's on that running backs room to kind of establish kind of a lead guy or a running by committee kind of deal and try to gain some more yards on the ground and take the pressure off of Grant so he doesn't feel like he has to, make that hero pass. He could just play within the system.
I was thinking about it the other day, and after the way last year ended, I started thinking, maybe it's a situation where teams are trying to take the ground game away and make Grant beat them. It may be that. Maybe that's the reason we've been somewhat limited. Like I said, I know we rushed, I think, for over 250 yards last game, but I don't know. It just seemed off still. I know it's hard to say that. If you rush for 250 yards, it's 250 yards, no matter what you say. But,
right.
It just, even like when it was the ones versus the ones, early in the game, it just didn't seem like we were getting a lot. It's like I said, maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's a situation where, teams are really focusing on the ground game, knowing that Marshall has had the ability to run the ball pretty well, with guys, like Brendan Knox and guys before him. And it may be a combination of that, the somewhat still newness. This is Rasheen Ali's, first real couple games. He didn't really run the ball last year. This
right.
is, this is his first real game action. And same thing for Knowledge. He rushed the ball, sparingly last year. In terms of that room, Sheldon's really the only one that's really seen the field a lot. So maybe it's those guys, feeling their way through things. Obviously the offensive line is still a work in progress. I know, Coach Huff kind of took offense to that. It seemed like in his press conference whenever we were, but that's just the way I see it. I'm not there every day. Obviously he is, but for me, that's an area to watch, to focus on, and to see how it works out. They were running a lot of bodies through there last week, and not just, late in the game, but even early in the game. You had guys, cycling in and out, Dalton Tucker. I saw Jack Murphy in there a couple times. There was, points in the game when, Salguero was at center, and Millette was out, and it just they were just cycling guys through there a lot last week. But it's like I said, sometimes it takes those guys a couple games to really gel, and it may be the combination of all things considered, with the rushing game. But like I said, it's I'm only going to take those first couple games with a grain of salt. I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from them. They were good wins, obviously, especially on the road in Navy.
Yeah.
But and you got to wonder too, how much were we really showing? I mean, were we keeping it somewhat vanilla through those first couple games? Who knows? I mean, obviously, I'm sure last week we weren't going too far into the playbook. I'm sure.
Right.
Certain of that.
Yeah.
But that's something else to think about. Maybe this week's the week that they open it up and really let things go. But my only drawback with that is Coach Huff doesn't seem like he's a guy that necessarily wants to hold back either. I mean, it seems like he wants things firing on all cylinders, and he's somebody that is going to put his best foot forward and just basically say, here it is. It's your job to stop it. But we'll see how it goes. Like I said, that's just something that for me, I want to see us. It's weird because when I was younger, I wanted video games and stuff like that. You just want to throw the crap out of the ball.
Oh yeah.
And as I've gotten older, like I'm not that I don't enjoy throwing the ball, but I mean like there's just something about being able to jam the ball down the throat.
Oh
of a
yeah.
defense on the ground that's just so rewarding.
Definitely.
But and just defeating. I mean, if you can just sit there and just nonstop down their throat consistently, I mean that's
something.
That's
One of the games that stood
with.
out to me in that regard was the bowl game that Marshall played in 2018. I think it was either 2018 or 2019 against the USF Bulls, led by Charlie Strong. And the team had probably 200 or 300 rushing yards and multiple touchdowns. I mean, Brendan got in there. Our former quarterback, Isaiah Green, got in there. And Keon Davis had a couple of big runs, and he was actually the bowl game MVP. And you really could have given the MVP of that game to the offensive line that night because they were plowing holes and they were getting the running backs big holes to run through. And that was a rewarding game to watch from that perspective. So I think it's going to take some time for those guys. I mean, you have to replace a couple of different pieces on the offensive line, but when you have Sartor and a combination of Tucker and Logan Osborne and those guys like that, one thing that I will say that's positive for them is they've kept Grant clean. They've kept Grant clean through 2 games now. I know, last week's opponent, they were who they were, but at the same time, they did keep him clean. So that's a positive and a feather in their cap. But I definitely think that in order for them to get to that next level that Coach Huff wants them to get to, they're going to have to be more balanced in terms of making sure that ground game is on point and takes the pressure off Grant. One last question here before we run. Jimmy says, when will we get Willie Johnson more involved? I've been looking for that deep ball to Willie a couple of times. Grant missed on a couple of them, but there's a couple of different ways to get Willie involved. I mean, not only on deep passes, but the scissors routes, something that they did a lot last year, and those end arounds where they would flip the ball to him and just let him run. I mean, I think you're going to get a little bit deeper into the playbook. So I think you're going to see a lot more Willie Johnson, not only in this game, but in the games to show up. So thanks to all of our commenters, both on Facebook and Twitter. We're live streaming on both Facebook and Twitter. Thanks to Artie and Jared from the Boneyard Podcast for joining us earlier in the show. Thank you to Aaron Perkins as well. And as always, thanks to you, Josh. And for those of you who missed it, it will be up on YouTube later. It will also be for you Herd Nation followers. It will be up on Old Fairfield and Herd Nation tomorrow morning or afternoon. So be on the lookout for that. For Josh Stowers, I'm Aaron Coleman saying so long. We'll talk to you next week ahead of the big one against App State in Boone, North Carolina. So we'll talk to you next week. And until then, go Herd.